Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Raymond Raconteur, and this evening I finished reading the final appendices in Raymond Brown's An Introduction to the New Testament. I'd finished reading Revelation last night, and so I read that chapter last night in this book, and then I did the appendices this evening, and that completes a 6-month sojourn with this book, and it was a great 6 months. This is an outstanding book. I highly recommend it. You do not have to be like a believing or practicing Christian to get something from that book. You know, just like you don't have to be a believing or practicing Christian to, I think, read the New Testament and find that it, you know, was worthwhile to read. And you know, I have plenty, like on my penguin green bar tops here. There's plenty of, you know, spiritual works from faiths I don't practice that I've found a great amount of wisdom in. So. About Brown's introduction, which is, again, outstanding. It is, you know, his primary purpose in this is to truly provide an introduction to a general reader for the New Testament. It is not a book about early Christianity. It is not primarily an apologia or apology. It's not a defense of Christianity where he's sitting there trying to, like, deal with nitpickers or something. He really is providing it as a companion to the books of the New Testament and to be read in conjunction with them. He's very clear on that. It is not to act as like a replacement. You can read this instead of reading the New Testament and you're good to go. You know, his primary focus is to provide scholarship, information, particularly around like the first century local context and audience for the books of the New Testament in his introduction. It's really well written. It's very lucid. He works to demystify certain Greek terms like koinonia, parousia, not so much around kerygma, but he does work to show where those words exist in the New Testament, why they're important, what they mean, what they meant probably for that writer and for that audience. So again, it really was an outstanding book. What I did was, and it was something he had recommended, was pretty much on a weekly basis over the past 6 months, I would read a book from the New Testament and then read the associated chapter in Brown's introduction. And then if I had, after I read his, you know, his chapter, if I have questions, I had time to go back and reread that book. For Revelation, before I read Revelation, I went back to the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament and read Ezekiel and Daniel and Zechariah, sort of to be able to recognize some of the imagery that the writer of Revelation put into that book. So, you know, as I said, you don't have to be a believing or practicing Christian to read this. Brown, of course, was a Catholic priest. He periodically mentions some, you know, particular points of like, this is where Catholics get this tradition, or this is where you know, Protestants and Catholics disagree, but he doesn't, that's not a primary focus. It's not an emphasis to point out divisions in Christianity. What he really seems to be interested, you know, from what I saw, was he wants to show that local context and try to point out that rather than as sort of an analogous representation within, there are judges who use like a textualist interpretation where it's like, this is what it says, and that's what it says is what it means. He looks at it as, okay, this is what it says, here's who it's going to, so here's what that would mean for these people, and what does that mean in for his writing, in a 20th century context. How do we take that first century context in Palestine or in Asia Minor or in Rome, and understanding that message, apply it to a 20th century, you know, global context, which I thought was, you know, perfectly appropriate. He has a format, so he gives a couple of chapters at the beginning around sort of his plan and some first century context, religious context, cultural context, and then he just jumps in with the Gospel of Mark, and it's semi-chronological. He goes through the Gospels, and then putting Acts with Luke, and he puts 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John with John, and then he does the letters of Paul, and then he ends with the general letters and Revelation. And then there are 2 appendices at the very end. But yeah, it was fantastic. I think, so for each chapter what he does is he gives a quick like one-page sort of, here's the most basic information you need to know, now sort of go read that book. And then he gives some ideas, he gives a general analysis, and he's careful not to repeat himself. So there are some of the letters of Paul where he'll say in the general analysis, this is very similar to this other letter. Rather than repeat myself, I'm going to just point out these differences as we go through it. Some of the analyses are much more specific, like particularly around the Gospel of John. But it's he gets this general analysis, and then he points out a couple of important things. So often, like the audience, who would have been receiving this, and how does that help us understand what we saw in the text in the analysis, what that means. Who's the author, some ideas around like the common Greek terms that are used, and sort of like the schools that existed in that first century, where you have early Christians who have different interpretations or different beliefs, and that's shown in the New Testament, and sort of like what are the common groups that exist, and then what are the links that exist between those groups. So he does that, and then he periodically, for certain letters or books, has a section like just devoted to a particular issue that's in there. And then finally he ends with some issues and problems for reflection, where he asks questions without necessarily answering them. He says, okay, a lot of times we think this, now that we've looked at this idea, what do you what do you think? This is something you could discuss if you were studying this book with a group. Here's some good questions. And then he has a fairly extensive bibliography. He does a nice job as well of presenting what he calls sort of like centrist positions within the introduction. So he will identify, here's sort of what most scholars think. If there are strong disagreements, he might identify that, but he doesn't go into like super minute detail around it. He'll instead say, here's the primary, here's the work you should go look at from that writer if that's something you're really interested in. And so he has this heavy like bibliography that's very useful. He'll periodically will say, he's transparent, he'll say, okay, this is what the majority of scholars think. I happen to think this other idea, but I'm going to talk in the book about this, and sort of here's where you can look me up and find my ideas. So again, I really highly recommend this. If you're a Christian, I would definitely find a copy and sort of read it to explore the New Testament a little more fully. If you're not, I think it might help if you're reading the New Testament and you want more information, you want more context especially, I think Brown would be a great resource. So that's all I have to say on this one. It was absolutely enjoyable, and so have a safe weekend, everybody.